Hey everyone, welcome to the House Democratic Caucus on Tuesday, May 5th. I'm Roy Hogan. I represent the city of Essex Junction. I don't have any announcements. I know that's kind of weird. No announcements. I can make something else. I'm not going to. We have a lot to do. But does anyone here have any announcements before we get started? No? All right. We'll ask again at the end. All right, we have a lot to go through because there's a lot of bills moving. We are going to start with S209 and actually to prohibiting civil arrest in sensitive locations with Rep Goodnow, who is talking.
Hey. Okay, so I'm going to keep this pretty short because I have a call at 11:30. This is S209, which is the sensitive locations for service of administrative civil warrants. I think Martin walked through this bill last public caucus, so I'm not going to go through the whole thing again. The biggest changes from the Senate side is that was passed over to House Judiciary was that we put back in state buildings. The language is pretty specific now. It's buildings owned wholly and controlled by the state or any political subdivision. So this means municipalities, county buildings, that need to be wholly owned and controlled. So there's a lot of discussion in committee around rented properties. This would not cover that. And it has to do with, it was too complicated right now to try to work through that. But just to remind people what this bill does is it's creating locations, it's expanding existing law for locations where an individual would be protected from civil or administrative warrants for being arrested. They would need to be arrested with a judicial warrant. The current law protects people traveling to, from, or remaining at a court proceeding. This would expand it to coming to, leaving, remaining at an educational institution, and then a new subsection protecting people who are currently at a number of locations. And those locations are the state buildings and municipal buildings and county buildings, the DMV, libraries, polling places, social services establishments, which is quite a long list that I won't go through in detail, places of worship, facilities related to child services and children's camps, and healthcare facilities. The second section of the bill is the definitions, and a lot of those things that I just listed out are defined in statute. So like healthcare facilities are defined. So it's fairly clear, but this is coming up this week, and it has changed some over the last couple of weeks. So we wanted to make sure that we gave people an opportunity to ask questions now with the current language that we have.
Any questions?
Of course. Bishop Colchester. Without getting into a list of the social service agencies, would those include both those run directly by the state or by a nonprofit social service agency on behalf of the state?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm just getting ready for by answering on the floor.
Any other questions?
And if you have questions and you want to talk to me one-on-one, I'm happy to meet with anybody. Just let me know.
So I believe you're voting today.
Voting today, so it'll be
Thursday, Friday. Great, thank you. All right, and next we have Representative Dolan, who is doing S208, which is an act relating to standards for law enforcement identification.
Okay, this is working. Yes, so Karen Dolan from Essex Junction. And similar to 209, 208 is set to be voted out of our committee today. It will be on the floor Thursday and Friday. And it's kind of the same situation. We just want to make sure that folks understand that there have been changes to the bill since it came over from the Senate. I know folks are like, yeah, I support it, I get it, and I just want to make sure that folks understand the changes. Again, Martin brought this up last week during caucus. But the significant thing that changed 208, this is the masking and identification bill, is that there was a decision from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals on April 22nd that found a similar bill from California unconstitutional. And so that really motivated us to, let's change the language, take a different track, and avoid that whole piece of it. And so what the bill does now, instead of creating a ban on certain types of masking and detailed instructions on how identification has to be for any law enforcement officer in Vermont, including federal, state, and local, it requires a model policy to be developed that would be done by the law enforcement review board, and that would be done by this October of 2020. I don't have the date right there. I think it's October of 2027 that they would have, or that's when it needs to be implemented. And that would be the goal. And this is following practice that we've done before with use of force policy, fair and impartial policing policy, is saying we have an expectation. We're bringing it to you, law enforcement body, to set the policy and make sure that all agencies have that in effect. So it has shifted from where it was in the Senate, and that's where I want to make sure folks understand where that is.
Any questions?
Any questions? You get to be.
David Durfee from Shaftesbury. Can you say a little bit more, Karen, about what happens from the, so if this bill becomes law, if we're asking for a model policy to be developed, do we know that that policy will be implemented, or does it go through something akin to a rulemaking process? What happens next?
Yes, happy to. I just need to pull up the notes on that. So it is that the law enforcement advisory board needs to develop, so this is an entity that already exists in Vermont. They need to develop a model policy addressing both identification standards and facial covering standards by July of 2027. So they will do that. Then what it is again, this is what has happened in other law enforcement policies, is that law enforcement agencies have the ability to create their own policy that meets those standards still in some way, or if they don't, by October 1st, 2027, the assumption is they've adopted the model policy that was created by the Law Enforcement Review Board. And so by October 1st of next year, all law enforcement will be, assuming all of this goes forward, under a model policy for facial coverings and identification. And then that follows the regular enforcement procedure that we have through the Criminal Justice Council if there are violations to a policy.
Any other questions?
Yeah, that's White for Waitsfield. Thank you. So I'm wondering why the timeline seems so extended, because we're giving them like a year and a half to create this policy. And then also, do you think this is satisfying? I mean, I've heard some discussion that we may not be able to come up with legislation that applies to federal workers. So is there an assumption that if this law enforcement review board is creating a policy, that they will be able to create a policy that does apply to federal workers, or where do you?
So sort of multiple questions in there. The timeline, again, we're trying to follow what we've used for policy development in the past. And I think it's a balance. This was the timeline that was requested, so we're trying to meet that need. It's certainly something that we can revisit if there happens to be a, increase of concern at the state level. But for right now, we felt like this was an adequate timeline. As far as the law enforcement review board's ability to, require standards for federal officers, that won't be, allowed. And that is the constitutional conflict that was addressed in the, appellate court decision.
One last question if there is one. I think we're good. Thank you. So that's going to be voted out today. It'll be on the floor Thursday, Friday. Next, we have S71, which is an act relating to data privacy and online surveillance with Representative Priestley.
Thank you, Representative Priestley, Bradford. Yeah, so we have S71 that's working its way through House Commerce. I would say we expect that it'll be voted on this week, so that's why we're announcing, but some of the elements are still in flux as we work through things and take testimony and work as a committee to figure out what we're doing on specific areas, notably the exemptions and definitions and things like that. But in general, the goal is to pass through a bill that is hearing business concerns, but also gives Vermonters rights they do not have, such as knowing where their data is being collected and is being sold. Allows them to correct it, to access it, to delete it, all of those things. And I don't know what else, maybe recreating that I'm missing.
That's what it does.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it does. Yeah, and also things like banning the sale of sensitive data and also restricting, prohibiting the use of minor sensitive personal data when it comes to targeted advertisement.
Great. Any questions?
Yeah,
Thank you so much. Angela Larson from Willis. Could you say a little bit about who or what types of products these restrictions would apply to? Particularly wondering, want to make sure that the prohibitions on collecting data of child users would pertain to education technology products.
Yeah, so unlike the kids code where it was very specifically kind of focused on like social media and that kind of stuff and gaming, that kind of stuff, this is broadly is getting everybody else, and everybody, including those big companies. Yes, so yeah. Everybody.
So it's something like anyone who collects and processes data.
Yes, and yeah, and the piece though, the big pieces we're working on, that is one of the things is the collection and processing of data and how we limit that or not is a big thing that we're trying to work with this week.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
The thresholds, applicability thresholds, sorry, getting prompted, are exactly match what Connecticut passed in 2025, which goes into effect for everyone, that processes Connecticut consumer data July 1st, which is a threshold of collecting the records of 35,000 Vermonters or more per year, the zero threshold on sensitive data and the sale of personal data as well. So, which is what Connecticut has in law right now. Yeah.
Great. So pay attention to the committee's work. They should be repeated later this week. All right, next we are going to do 8949, which is the yield bill with Representative Farnese.
And Pickle.
And Kimball.
I support.
I'll remember all the numbers. They'll be awesome.
So much.
Hi, Representative Kornheiser, Chair of Ways and Means from Brattleboro, Representative Kimball, what are you? Ranking Member Ways and Means from Woodstock, Reading, and Plymouth.
Yes, thank you.
So we have just received the yield bill back from, this feels extra loud and echoey today. Does it feel like that to you?
Yes.
Terrible. How's that? Better?
Yes.
Okay. We just received the yield bill back from the Senate. It's on the notice calendar right now. The Senate did a lot of things to it. One, the most straightforward probably is they put the bulk of the general fund transfer towards just a single year, whereas the bill that we sent them spread it out over 2 years. So that will create a cliff for next session without a clear path to fill that budget hole with the one-time spending. One thing that's in there. Second thing is an excess spending threshold. They lowered it really significantly. So they put S220, which you might have heard about, into the yield bill. And that lowered the excess spending threshold from 118, where it is in current law, to 112%. In order to, that is a really, really dramatic change in a single year. And most school districts are not able to shift their budgets that quickly without significant harm to educational quality. In order to essentially get that very extreme change through committee and get the votes they needed and have that all work, they added a bunch of exemptions and hold harmless provisions. One of those exemptions from the excess spending threshold is all school construction dollars. That is really challenging because there are no rules really attached to it. And so that school construction can happen anywhere in any district that's willing and able to vote for that. That's really quite at odds with the work we did in our great big education transformation bill, where we were looking at really strategic investments in education school construction spending. And the second was a really interesting provision where if you spend more over the excess spending threshold 1 year, and then the next year, your district is spending less than it did the prior year, but still above the excess spending threshold, then you're exempt. This has the potential to really drive spending up in very significant ways, perhaps counterintuitive ways, and paired with the school construction is really at odds with the strategic goals we've set in place with other work and our desire to stabilize spending in the education fund. And so those are the pieces of policy that we were reckoning with. One last detail was they put some money into the retro credit from the general fund transfer. So that's a funded piece of policy that we haven't spent time on before and is great for Vermonters. And we'll dig into that as well, but that's sort of where the bill is right now. Anything you want to add, sir?
That's good.
Okay, thank you. Great. Oh, we've taken some testimony that folks can go catch up with. There's spreadsheets to see, just on our website to see like where your district shakes out at different excess spending thresholds. We're going to take a little bit more testimony tomorrow and then take a vote on what comes next for us.
Hi, Kathleen James from Manchester. Sorry, could you explain again about the last exemption about how if you're spending less, but you're still right above the excess spending? Sorry, could you give me that one again? Thanks. And explain for folks, I was following and then I lost you at the very end, how that could have the impact of driving spending up, because that is counterintuitive and I think that'd be helpful for folks to understand.
So let's say if I'm a school district and this year I spend $1 billion and next year I spend $1 less than $1 billion, next year I'm not considered over the excess spending threshold anymore and I'm not subject to those penalties. And so it could create an incentive to spend up in order to then spend a little bit less. And that would be a very natural response of anyone managing their finances who wants to make sure they're keeping tax rates as low as possible for the voters in their district, without the ability to see across the state and see the impact on taxpayers all over the district, all over the state.
Charlie Kimball, what's on there's?
Yeah.
There's also a third off ramp. So in that, as Emily was describing, the spending, if it's the same as the previous year, that's either on a per pupil spending or your overall education spending. So you can either look at it either way. And then third off ramp is if you have some extraordinary expenses, maybe it's a sudden loss of students, so your long-term weighted ADM goes down. or there's some emergency building repair or something else that's beyond your control as a school district, and it creates a body of the Secretary of Education, some business managers, some superintendents to evaluate whether or not it was extraordinary enough so that you couldn't control it. So therefore, you also are relieved from being considered over the excess spending threshold. So there's the three off ramps. There's a lot of concerns around them. Some folks, I know I speak for myself and representatives from Colchester, that like removing the excess spending threshold for school construction. But it does then say, okay, that doesn't require you to reduce spending in other areas. Yeah.
And that special group that can provide those exemptions, sounds like sort of a nice escape valve or release valve on the whole system. But any of the folks who were tasked with being on that committee feel very, very uncomfortable with being on it or sort of making those decisions on behalf of their colleagues.
Yes, Brett Boston from Colchester. I'm concerned that schools will be disincentivized to do deferred maintenance or renovations that are only going to increase in cost if they postpone that because they're worried about it going to excess spending. So how can that be avoided?
So we usually try to differentiate sort of ongoing deferred maintenance from sort of the bonding that results from school construction. And it's that bonding that is exempted. And we want to make sure that sort of those big new projects are aligned with our overall strategic goals for education around the state. And that is not covered in this.
I like clarification on what Charlie said about, what Representative Kimball said about per pupil spending versus overall spending. And then I have a question, does the excess spending threshold account for inflation? And how? Yeah, and is there an appeal process? Thank you.
Ooh, great. Yes, there's an appeals process. That's what that little group is that we talked about that sort of presides over things. The second question, does it account for inflation? Because it's a percentage of spending, 112% or 118% as it is in current law, then yes, it does account for inflation in that way. And the last one was, the per pupil. So on the sort of release valves or exemptions from the excess spending threshold, and this idea that you can spend more, and as long as you're spending less the next year, you're not subject to the excess spending threshold anymore. That could be a per pupil spending as one path, or it can be a total spending as another path. I think the per pupil spending was designed to account for the idea that you might have a significant change in number of pupils year over year. We used to have something called phantom pupils, and I think it was intended as sort of a tinier version of that. But again, it creates some perverse incentives that we want to make sure we're reconciling.
Do you have another comment?
Wait, hold on, Elizabeth wanted to follow.
I think you want to follow up to the question.
It would just be, I think, helpful,
What's not on?
helpful if you would explain 118% of what?
So thank you. So 118% is first you take the average from the previous year as to what the education spending was across the state. And you adjust that for inflation upwards by NIPA. And then if your spending is 118% over that, that is the excess spending threshold. That's how it's calculated. So it does account for it.
Twice.
Yeah. Thank you. All right.
Were all three questions answered? Sorry. Great. You have one more question right here. One over there.
And then we do need to move on.
Okay.
Thank you, Representative Stevens. So Representative Kornheiser, this idea that we can have a situation where somebody spends over, it's penalized, and then the next year they're not penalized. This reminds me, at least in concept, of what you dealt with several years ago, where we said, oh, there's a cap on how much your
property taxes will go up, and it was presented and passed as if there were going to only be 5 or 7 school districts that qualified for this based on their demographics, et cetera. And it turned out to be only 5 didn't do that, and we had to change that. And so I appreciate the fact that you built the system up to this point where that isn't available to school districts, because it isn't natural, without describing anything else to it, it is a natural response of, oh, if we spend it now, then we can spend again next year. Is that what we're talking about with this situation here?
Well, it is structured differently than that past situation, which I like to think of as the time we broke the education fund. I do have I have a similar gut response to it, and the staff, finds that there could be similar impacts, yes.
Do we have time for 2 questions or only 1?
Two if they're short.
We're really like here for other questions anytime, so.
Candace, and then we have Aaron.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of where your committee is going to come out on the excess spending threshold? The proposed at 118, currently at 112. You did all those scenarios, which were extremely helpful to see how our school districts would fare, and just any sense of where you think it makes sense without really penalizing schools who are already struggling.
Well, I don't want to get ahead of the committee. I imagine at this point in the session, we would move to a committee at conference rather than sending a bill back to the Senate.
Hi, Brett Brady from Williston. Can you talk a little bit more about the extraordinary circumstances that might impact a district? I know you talked about buildings, but you said large fluctuation in student numbers. And I'm trying to conceptualize how that might also interplay with our challenging demographics. And if you had declining enrollment somewhere in potentially disincentivizing hard choices, but things that, may be playing out in places due to lower enrollment, and this would almost take that kind of reality off the table. I guess it depends on the details.
So the extraordinary circumstances that are allowed to be exempted by this special committee is not defined really. And that's one of the reasons that the folks on that committee are so uncomfortable with it. In terms of the extraordinary circumstances that might come up in the context of those 2 other escape valves, that's not at all the phrase I want. What is it? Release valve, a release valve, off ramp, whatever. Those can be any, but I think the scenario the Senate was working with was this idea that a district might see, especially a smaller district, could lose a number of pupils year over year and not be able to sort of catch up with the restructuring that they may need to do to accommodate it. And then not need to because of the particular way that it's structured.
That's great, perfect. Yeah, the Senate did not put any more specific language than that. As one member of our committee sitting at the table said, it's big enough to drive a truck through. Yeah, so we need to figure out if it's a big truck or a small truck.
Okay, enough. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. All right, wait. So we have 3 more. I'm gonna try and get you all out of here by 12:15. S198, enacting to regulation of tobacco products, tobacco substitutes with Representative Wood and noise. Or noise.
Thank you. I'll be quick on this. So a week ago, we had an update from Representative from Jericho. This bill came to us from Commerce. Kind of big picture is this is basically decoupling Department of Tax from Department of Liquor Control on how we regulate tobacco products. So before, it's always been Department of Tax did the wholesales. There's about 30 wholesalers. This will all come underneath DLC, but our portion of it through Human Services is more looking at population health. So we make sure that tobacco substitutes are included as part of tobacco products. We're looking at removing the penalties for those under 21 who are caught with tobacco products or vape products. And I'll talk more about that a little bit. It's still going to be illegal to possess. And if you are caught, what we're going to do is say that encouraging community service and trying to help people quit. So making them have access to tobacco cessation. And some of the things that we're banning in this is they have little vape pens that have video games built into them. And while you're playing the video games, you get like points for vaping. So these aren't going to be allowed in Vermont. And from when we're done with it, it's going to Ways and Means because there's some tax changes in it. If anyone has any questions, but our portion, we're kind of in the middle of markup on this. We'll be taking some more testimony or working on it more today,
Yeah.
voting it out hopefully today. So if anyone has any questions,
Questions?
all right.
Right? Thank
Thanks.
you. All right, we actually only have one more. So Representative Black is going to talk about S64. Lost the title, an act relating to amendments to the scope of practice for optometrists.
Thanks, Representative Melissa Black of Essex. Hold on a second. So at 64, we are doing final markup and possible vote on this this afternoon. We have it on our schedule. So in I think it was 2021, somewhere around there, the legislature tasked the Office of Professional Regulation with developing a sunrise report on the expansion of the scope of practice for optometrists to be able to perform certain procedures, laser procedures, surgical procedures. And they came back to us in 22 with a report that indicated that it should not be expanded at this time. They indicated that there wasn't really consensus in the education and they couldn't get curriculum from optometrist educational systems. But then they came back to us again in 24 that they were able to obtain that. So the bill S64 is essentially the Office of Professional Regulations recommendations for expanding the scope of practice. And it would create sort of a new specialty within optometry to, let's say, there would be advanced therapeutic procedure specialties. And it would allow them to, with certain requirements based on education and some additional preceptor training, that they would be able to provide services, certain laser services and certain surgical procedures, kind of like of the eyelid, things like that. And next up, I've had to learn way too many things that I don't know. So the bill is in committee right now. We do have to amend it a little bit. It hadn't been contemplated that in order for Medicaid coverage, that you actually have to have a state plan amendment to CMS. So we have to seek a state plan amendment. So we're going to be looking at language today to add that to the bill and hopefully vote it out today. And it will need to go to government operations. And it will also need to go to Ways and Means because it is a new specialty. So obviously fees involved with professional regulation. And it will also probably need to make a stop in appropriations because of coverage of Medicaid. So, happy to take any questions. Oh, I have a microphone to say it first. Thank you, Chair Black. I have been getting a lot of emails on both sides of this. Please don't do this, whatever you do. Please do this. And so I'm left feeling very confused. So I'm wondering if there's consensus on this. from all the medical powers of be or whoever would be the ones talking about this, there is consensus among optometrists that their scope of practice should be expanded, and there is consensus amongst ophthalmologists who are usually medical doctors or there's osteopathy, that it should not be. So there is consensus among the two parties. I will say in testimony, as anyone that's been around for a while knows about the I wars. And it was presented to us from the Office of Professional Regulation. They have been working for years and years with the Board of Medical Practice to come up with a solution to make recommendations that there could be consensus on. And it was agreed by both parties in our testimony that we took that that process was not able to, the consensus would not be obtained. And so therefore we were, and the words were that the legislature is the referee. So this is the referee bill.
Karen, one thing I'm noticing is that if we just have one microphone on at a time, it helps with the feedback. So when a question is being answered, if you don't mind turning it off, that might help.
Can you tell me if macular degeneration is exempt from the optometrist treatment?
You'll have to give me a moment to read the bill.
Let's see it.
There are certain injections, so included are injections of therapeutic pharmaceutical agents into the eyelid or its adnexa, including into the subconjunctival space and including injections for the removal of chalazion and injections to administer local anesthesia. So if I am correct, and I don't know a great deal about injections for macular degeneration, I believe that they are injections that actually go into the eyeball. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't see if you're nodding. So this would allow for injections just sort of around into the tissues surrounding your eye, not injections into the eyeball. So I do not believe that injections for macular degeneration would be allowed.
Would you consider an amendment specifically stating that friendly?
I do not believe that even in medical education and training that optometrists are trained on that. So I don't think that I would find that friendly because I don't believe they're trained on that.
So you would think it friendly? Yeah.
Well, I would not find it friendly.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
They're so friendly.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there's a requirement that they do a 32-hour sort of training on all of these procedures, and that is not one of the things that they're trained on.
We have two questions over here. Okay.
Mike Moricky from Putney. If you said this already, I apologize, but how many other states do this?
I can't give you the total of all states that have some sort of expanded scope of practice. I think there's about 20. Some states have only relegated it to either that they can do laser procedures, and some have made it so that they can't do laser procedures, but they can do sort of injection and work on the adnexa. And there are, it's either 7 or 8, it might be 8. There are 8 states that have expanded scope of practice to all of these types of things. If you read the Sunrise report, it actually goes into what each state does, and it's amazing how different states figure out how to do professional regulation, because they all have different procedures, not through the legislature.
Representative Brown from Richmond, I had a question, is this a rural access issue and will expanding the scope of practice for optometrists potentially help rural Vermonters access care more efficiently, or is there something in there that we should all be thinking about as well?
There is anecdotal evidence around access to care. I will say I was rereading the Sunrise report last night, and the OPR, addressed the access of care. There are studies that say that there is an access problem in the United States, not specific to Vermont. And then there are studies that say that there's actually not an access problem. And they were sort of agnostic in the report on access issues. And they did not look at access in Vermont other than testimony that they received or, written comment through their written comment period.
Great, thank you. So as Rep. Black said, potentially voting out today, but then we'll have to go to DevOps and Ways and Means, so as a path forward. That's it for today. Does anyone have any announcements? Great, have a fantastic week, and we can go offline.